Have you ever seen a mutant ship that cost the equivalent of an entire country's national budget? Imagine this. Mad engineers take a massive battleship and stitch it together with an aircraft carrier. The result is a steel Frankenstein that struck terror and provoked only one question. What on earth is that? Japan put everything on the line. Literally, they spent more on their fleet than on medicine, roads, and the entire army combined. But do you know the most shocking secret? They created an air group that was never supposed to return to the ship. It was a one-way ticket, built into the blueprints before they even took off. Why did these maritime monsters head into their decisive battle with completely empty hangars? What terrible truth did the command hide from its pilots? And how did the Empire's greatest hope turn into the most expensive and useless decoy in the history of warfare? Today, I will reveal the secret of the Ise, a ship built out of absolute desperation. You will learn details that will make your hair stand on end and see a finale that is impossible to forget. July 1945, the Sea of Japan. A pilot looks down through the cockpit glass. Below him is the Kure naval base. Smoke, fire, and ships. He has seen battleships before. He has seen aircraft carriers. He knows what they look like. A battleship has main battery turrets, superstructures, and a narrow deck. An aircraft carrier has a wide, flat deck from bow to stern and no turrets. But what lay below was neither. At the front, 4 massive gun turrets. At the back, a flat flight deck 70 meters long. It was as if someone took a battleship and an aircraft carrier and simply joined them together. The pilot didn't waste time thinking. He began his attack run. But the question remained, what was it? It was the Ise, one of 2 ships the Japanese Empire built in a state of desperation, when the war was already lost, but they weren't ready to admit it yet. The story of these ships doesn't begin in 1943, when they started the conversion. And it doesn't begin in 1941, when the Pacific War broke out. It starts earlier, at the beginning of the 20th century, when Japan decided to become a great naval power. At any cost. Literally, any. In a few minutes, you will learn that the Japanese naval construction program costs more than the country's entire annual state budget. That the ships we are talking about received an air group that was never meant to return to the deck, and that in their final battle, they set out without a single aircraft. But first, we need to understand where it all came from. In the early 20th century, Japan looked at the world powers and understood one thing. Whoever controls the sea controls everything. Trade routes, resources, colonies, influence. In that era, a navy was not just a tool of war. It was a statement about who you were in this world, and Japan wanted to make that statement loud and clear. Japanese engineers carefully studied foreign experience, the Kongo-class battlecruisers, and here is an important detail. The first of them was not built in Japan. It was ordered from Great Britain. The Japanese bought foreign technology, took it apart, and learned, and they quickly began making their own. Based on the Kongo, they designed the Fuso-class battleships, 6 twin-gun main battery turrets. In terms of speed, armor, and firepower, these ships surpassed their American counterparts. Japan wasn't just building a fleet, it was building a fleet that was meant to be the best. But the money ran out before all the planned ships were completed. Funding was frozen, construction stopped, and then something interesting happened. While the money was being sought, the engineers thought. For 2 years, they looked at the blueprints and found weak spots. When funding finally appeared, the project had changed so much that they decided to designate the new ships as a separate class. Thus, the Ise-class was born. But that wasn't even the most ambitious thing Japan came up with in those years. In 1907, a program called 8-8 was adopted. 8 battleships and 8 battle cruisers. A fleet that was supposed to dominate the entire Pacific Ocean and secure Japan's status as a great naval power. It sounds impressive, but here's the figure that explains everything. The cost of this program exceeded Japan's entire annual state budget. Not a portion of the budget, not half, the whole thing. Imagine a country that decided to spend more on its fleet than it spends in a year on everything else combined. Roads, army, medicine, officials, everything. That is what the 8-8 program was. Naturally, in that form, it was impossible. The Japanese compromised and approved a scaled-back version, the 8-4 program. 8 battleships and 4 battlecruisers. Still expensive, but at least theoretically feasible. And then war broke out in Europe. 1914 changed everything. International markets, material prices, political priorities, everything shifted. The 8-4 program was canceled, but 2 ships were still laid down. In May 1915, construction of the Ise and its sister ship, the identical Hyuga, began at the shipyards. They were launched in late 1916 and early 1917, respectively. Japan did not get its dream fleet. It got a compromise. 2 massive, expensive, uniquely outstanding compromises. And it was in that word, compromise, that the entire future story was already hidden. Imagine you are standing on the pier. Before you is the Ise, 216 meters of steel from bow to stern. To walk the length of the hull, it would take you nearly 3 minutes. Full displacement, 40,000 tons. For comparison, the famous Titanic weighed 46,000 tons. Roughly the same scale. Only instead of passenger cabins, armor, guns, and boilers. The armor on the Ise was not just thick, it was well thought out. The main armor belt was a steel wall that stretched along the entire side from the first to the last gun turret. At its thickest point, it was 305 millimeters. That is roughly the thickness of 3 bricks stacked together. Toward the ends of the hull, the bow and stern, the armor thinned to 76 millimeters. The upper part of the hull was protected by 203 millimeters of steel. Horizontal protection over the engine room was more than 100 millimeters. It wasn't a ship, it was a floating fortress. The propulsion system originally produced 56,000 horsepower. During trials, the Ise reached 23.6 knots, about 44 kilometers per hour. For a ship weighing 40,000 tons, this was a very decent result. Fuel reserves provided a range of nearly 18,000 kilometers at a speed of 14 knots. Later, oil-fired boilers were installed, increasing power to 80,000 horsepower. But the main feature of any battleship was the guns. The Ise had 12 of them. 6 twin main battery turrets, with each gun having a caliber of 356 millimeters. The same guns were used on the Kongo and Fuso-class battleships. Japanese engineers knew this gun well and trusted it. Now stop for a second and imagine this. An armor-piercing shell from the 1933 model weighed 670 kilograms. That is roughly the same as an adult horse. Such a shell flew out of the barrel at a speed of 770 meters per second, faster than sound travels the same distance. And it traveled 35.5 kilometers. 35.5 kilometers is a distance from which you cannot see the target with the naked eye. You fire where you calculate the enemy should be, and you hit. Reloading took between 30 and 40 seconds. Secondary artillery consisted of 20 140mm guns concentrated in the forward part of the hull. In 1921, anti-aircraft defense was provided by 4 76mm anti-aircraft guns. Subsequently, the anti-aircraft measures were changed multiple times, including the installation of rocket launchers, which turned out to be completely useless. Underwater, hidden by the armored hull, were torpedo tubes. Caliber, 533 millimeters, 3 tubes on each side. The Ise and its sister ship, Hyuga, entered service in December 1917 and April 1918, respectively. The First World War had not yet ended at that point, but the ships never got a chance to participate. They were born powerful, well-armed, and well-protected, but already slightly too late. And this lateness would haunt them their entire lives. From 1918 to 1941, the Ise and Hyuga did what most warships do in peacetime. They patrolled. They participated in maneuvers. They jointly cruised the coasts of China. They looked imposing during joint naval reviews. 2 massive, expensive ships that faithfully consumed coal, fuel oil, and maintenance money, and did absolutely nothing of what they were built for. 23 years. And then came December 1941. Early on the Sunday morning of December 7, 1941, a Japanese carrier strike group attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands. 353 aircraft in 2 waves. In 2 hours, 8 American battleships were sunk or seriously damaged. Hundreds of aircraft were destroyed, and over 2,400 people were killed. The Ise and Hyuga did not participate in this strike. They were part of the covering force, staying at sea to intercept any American ship that might try to interfere with the operation. An important role, but an invisible one. While the carriers struck, the battleships simply waited on the sidelines. The United States declared war on the Japanese Empire the following day. The Pacific War had begun. And initially, it went exactly as Japan had planned. In the early months, the Japanese fleet acted swiftly. Malaya, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, present-day Indonesia, Burma, Singapore, vast territories fell under the control of the Japanese Empire, one after another. It seemed the plan was working. It seemed the fleet was invincible. But every plan has a limit. In late May 1942, the Japanese command conceived an operation intended to put a final end to the war in the Pacific. The target? Midway Atoll, a small speck of land in the center of the Pacific, roughly halfway between Japan and the Hawaiian Islands. Capture it, force the American fleet into battle, and destroy it. The Ise and Hyuga were part of the Aleutian Support Force. Their task was to provide cover for Admiral Yamamoto's main forces. Again, on the sidelines. Again, waiting. What happened at Midway Atoll from June 4th to 7th, 1942, is something the Japanese fleet would never forget. American intelligence had cracked the Japanese plans in advance. American carriers were already waiting. When the Japanese planes flew off to attack the atoll, their carriers were left almost unprotected. American dive bombers attacked. In a few hours, the Japanese fleet lost 4 heavy aircraft carriers. 4. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Hiryu. Think about that number. The Japanese Empire took 2 to 4 years to build a heavy aircraft carrier. Thousands of workers, millions of yen, years of training flight crews, and training a carrier pilot took at least 2 years of intense work. All of that vanished in a single day. It is as if a country spent a decade building its 4 largest airports and lost them in a few hours. Not just planes, not just runways, the entire infrastructure, all the trained crews, everything. Along with the carriers, the most experienced pilots perished. People who had practiced landing on a pitching deck for years. People who could not be quickly replaced. Japanese carrier aviation received the blow from which it never fully recovered until the end of the war. The Ise and Hyuga once again remain on the sidelines at the Battle of Midway. They didn't lose a single man. They returned to port safe and sound. And that was precisely the problem. The Japanese command desperately needed aircraft carriers. They didn't have any. But they had battleships, large ones, intact ones, mostly unused ones. Someone looked at the blueprints of the Ise and asked a question. What if? This question was voiced in staff offices at the end of 1942. By February 1943, it had turned into an official order. The Ise and Hyuga would go in for conversion. They would be turned into something the world's navies had never seen before. Something that was neither a battleship nor an aircraft carrier. Something Japanese engineers created from scratch, in record time, under conditions of a growing shortage of everything. And even then, on paper, a trap was hidden in this project. February 1943, the naval shipyard at Kure. The Ise is in dry dock. Hundreds of workers surround it. Cranes, welding machines, clatter, sparks, the smell of hot metal in seawater. They are removing the turrets. The 5th and 6th main battery turrets, 2 massive steel structures at the rear of the hull, each weighing hundreds of tons. Slowly, with the straining screech of cables, lift off the deck and are moved ashore. 12 guns out of 24 remain. Another 12 will never fire again. In their place, they began to build something else. The engineers worked quickly. They had no choice. The war wouldn't wait. The Japanese fleet needed carriers, and they needed them now. The task was clear. Take what is available and make it into what is missing. This is what they came up with. The rear part of the hull was lengthened. Directly over the spot where the removed turrets once stood, they built a hangar for planes. And over the hangar, they laid a flight deck, 70 meters long. 70 meters is roughly 7 stories of a residential building laid horizontally. For takeoff, it was enough. For landing, it was not. We will talk about that a bit later. Now look at the final result. In the forward part of the ship, 4 main battery turrets with 12 guns. A battleship. In the rear part, a hangar, a flight deck, and catapults. An aircraft carrier. But here was the problem. The 3rd and 4th main battery turrets, those left closest to the rear, could no longer fire directly backward. The flight deck completely blocked their firing arcs to the stern. They could only fire to the sides. The battleship lost part of what makes a battleship a battleship. And now, about the planes. The Ise's air group consisted of 2 parts. The first, 12 3-seat Yokosuka D4Y Ise dive bombers. Each carried a half-ton bomb, a serious weapon. These machines were fast and accurate, feared across the Pacific. The second part, 10 Aichi E-16A reconnaissance seaplanes. Unlike the dive bombers, they didn't take off from the deck but from the water via catapult and returned to the ship using a crane. But now, attention. The most important moment. The 70-meter flight deck was only long enough for a takeoff run. For landing, you needed 2 to 3 times more space. Therefore, the designers from the very beginning built a feature into the project that sounds like madness, but was an official technical solution. The dive bombers take off via catapult. They complete their mission, and they do not return. Not because they will be shot down, though that was also possible, but because there is nowhere to return to. The deck is too short. After the sortie, the pilots were supposed to find another aircraft carrier or the nearest land-based airfield and land there. Think about that. Japanese engineers designed an air group that physically could not return to its own ship. They didn't try to solve this problem. They simply included it in the technical requirements as a given. 12 planes, 12 crews. They take off, and that's it. There is no way back. Work on the Ise and Hyuga proceeded in parallel at 2 shipyards. By the end of 1943, both ships were ready. On paper, it was a breakthrough. Battleships that were outdated and nearly useless received a new role. The fleet got 2 ships that could both fire heavy shells and carry aircraft. The problem was something else. While the engineers were converting the ships, the war in the Pacific continued, and it was going in a direction the Japanese command had not planned. By the time the hybrids were ready for service, it turned out that something important had happened. The planes for them existed. Technically, on paper. But the pilots? No longer. To understand what happened next, we need to step away from the Ise and Hyuga for a minute. We need to talk about the pilots. Training a carrier pilot is not just flight training. It is a separate profession that takes years to learn. Taking off from a pitching deck, landing on that same deck, at speed, in the dark, in a storm. Navigating over the open ocean without a single landmark. Dive bombing under anti-aircraft fire. Before the war, Japanese naval aviators went through one of the toughest training programs in the world. Selection was brutal. Out of 100 candidates, only a few made it to graduation. It took 2 to 3 years of intense work to train one experienced carrier pilot. Now remember Midway. In June 1942, along with 4 aircraft carriers, the Japanese fleet lost more than 100 carrier pilots. Not novices, the best. People who had fought from the first day of the war. People who had attacked Pearl Harbor. People whose experience was completely irreplaceable. But Midway was not the only blow. In August 1942, the Battle of Guadalcanal. More losses among experienced pilots. In October of the same year, the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. Again. By the end of 1942, Japanese carrier aviation had lost a significant part of its pre-war backbone. The fleet tried to train new pilots, but accelerated training gave accelerated results. Young aviators died in their first battles, never having time to gain real experience. It was a vicious circle with no way out. And against this backdrop, imagine, at the end of 1943, the Japanese fleet receives two freshly converted ships, the Ise and Hyuga, with hangars, with catapults, with flight decks, everything ready to receive an air group. Only one thing left: to find the pilots. The fleet looked at the lists. It looked at the available planes. It looked at the map of the war, which by 1944 was clearly not turning in Japan's favor. And it made a decision that seems incredible today. The planes of the aviation-carrying battleships would stay on shore. Not because they weren't there, not because the catapults didn't work, but because every experienced pilot was valuable. Every plane was valuable. And wasting them on sorties from ships that physically could not take the planes back meant simply throwing people and machines into the sea. It was decided to leave the air groups on shore, to counter enemy carriers should they appear within range. Think about what happened. The Japanese fleet spent almost a year converting two battleships. Hundreds of workers, thousands of tons of steel, dismantled main battery turrets that could never be returned, a lengthened hull, a new hangar, catapults, and after all that, it simply left the planes on shore. The Ise and Hyuga went to sea as aviation-carrying battleships, without a single plane on board. On the outside, a flight deck, catapults, a hangar, a crane for lifting seaplanes. Inside the hangar, empty. This was not a failure of the engineers. The engineers did everything required of them. This was a failure of the system, which set a task for itself and did not have the resources to fulfill it. Which built ships for planes that didn't exist, for pilots who were no longer there. But the command didn't intend to just leave the ships at the pier. The Ise and Hyuga still had 12 main battery guns. They still had armor. They still had speed. And the Japanese fleet found a use for them. However, this use had nothing to do with either battleships or aircraft carriers. They were sent to die. October 1944. The Japanese Empire was losing the war. Not slowly and imperceptibly, but quickly and obviously. American forces were systematically recapturing the islands of the Pacific one by one. The defensive line was shrinking. Fuel was scarce. Planes were scarce. People were scarce. And then the Japanese command decided on an operation that was supposed to change the course of the war in one blow. The operation was named Shogo, which in Japanese means victory. The goal: to destroy the American landing fleet at Leyte Island in the Philippines. If this succeeded, the American offensive would stall. If not, Japan would only have to wait for the end. The stakes were absolute. The plan was complex. Several Japanese task forces were to attack the American fleet from different directions simultaneously. But the Japanese had one major problem left: American aircraft carriers. By October 1944, the American fleet had a massive carrier task force under the command of Admiral Halsey. As long as these carriers were nearby, any Japanese attack would drown under waves of carrier-based aircraft. They had to be removed from the battlefield. But the Japanese couldn't kill the American carriers. There were too few planes and experienced pilots left. That meant they had to deceive them. This is where Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa enters the story. Ozawa was given command of a force that included the last Japanese aircraft carriers, and the Ise and Hyuga. His task was formulated very clearly: go toward the American fleet, be seen, let yourself be discovered, and draw Halsey's carriers as far away from Leyte as possible. This was a decoy force. Ozawa went into battle knowing in advance that his force would likely be destroyed. This was no secret to him, his officers, or his sailors. They knew, and they went anyway. On the Ise and Hyuga, there wasn't a single plane. Think about the picture. 2 ships with flight decks, hangars, and catapults, heading into battle as part of a carrier force. A force that was supposed to represent a threat, that was supposed to make the Americans believe they were facing a real strike force, with empty hangars. On the morning of October 25, 1944, American aircraft discovered Ozawa's force north of Cape Engano, off the coast of the Philippines. Halsey took the bait. His carrier force turned north and headed for the intercept. The trap worked, but a price had to be paid. The first wave of American planes appeared over Ozawa's force around 8 in the morning. Dozens of machines attacked from different directions. The anti-aircraft guns of the Japanese ships opened fire. The sky turned black with bursts. Planes were falling, both Japanese and American. Then came the second wave, then the third, the fourth, the fifth. 5 massive airstrikes in one day, each with several dozen planes. American pilots methodically, wave after wave, worked over the Japanese force. The aircraft carrier Zuiho took several direct hits from bombs and torpedoes and went to the bottom. The flagship carrier Zuikaku, the last of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, received many hits and sank in the afternoon. Along with it, the living thread from the start of the war to its end went underwater. And the Ise? The Ise received minor damage. Not because its crew fought better than others. Not because it was luckier than the carriers. But because American pilots prioritized attacking carriers first. A battleship with a flight deck was a lower priority target for them. A ship built as a battleship, converted to a carrier, sent into battle without planes as a decoy, survived precisely because the enemy didn't take it seriously. This is perhaps the most bitter outcome of all. Admiral Ozawa fulfilled his task. Halsey's carriers went north and did not return to Leyte in time. The Japanese forces attacking from other directions got their chance. The story of that battle branches out further, and there is tragedy there too. But for the Ise and Hyuga, the Battle of Cape Engano was over. They emerged from it afloat, with empty hangars, with untouched catapults, with flight decks that no one ever landed on, alive, almost unscathed, and absolutely useless in the role for which they had been converted. A month after the battle, the catapults were dismantled from the ships. Officially, this meant one thing. The aviation-carrying battleships Ise and Hyuga would never be used as carriers again, under any circumstances. The experiment was closed. But the war for them was not yet over. November 1944. The catapults are being removed from the Ise and Hyuga. Workers disconnect the mountings. Cranes lift the metal structures and carry them ashore. Where the equipment for launching planes once stood, empty sections of deck with mounting bolts remain. No one makes solemn speeches. No one records this moment in orders as something special. They simply remove iron that is no longer needed. And then the ships receive a new order. After the Battle of Cape Engano, the Japanese fleet withdrew to Lingga Island, part of the Indonesian archipelago, about halfway between Singapore and the island of Borneo. One of the few remaining Japanese naval bases with fuel reserves was located there. By late 1944, fuel had become for the Japanese fleet much like blood is for a living organism. Without it, everything stops. American aircraft found them here too. An air raid destroyed several tankers and supply facilities on the island. Reserves were melting away. The situation was becoming critical. And then, the command made a decision that finally put an end to the military careers of both ships. The Ise and Hyuga would go to Kure, home, to Japan. But not empty. Now, stop and imagine this scene. Before you is a warship, 216 meters long, 12 main battery guns, armor 3 bricks thick, a ship built to destroy enemy squadrons at a distance of 35 kilometers. Now, drums of aviation gasoline are being loaded into its holds. Hundreds of tons of fuel, crates of materials and equipment. Everything that needed to be delivered to Japan, and that there was nothing else to carry it on. Because the tankers were destroyed, the cargo ships were sunk, and these two ships were sitting at the pier, waiting for orders. But that's not all. More than 1,000 people boarded the Ise and Hyuga. Not sailors, not soldiers. Workers, civilian specialists who needed to be brought to Japan. People with tools and suitcases. People who had never had military training. People who looked at the gun turrets over their heads and likely tried to convince themselves that this was the safest vessel they could be on. A combat battleship. Aviation fuel in the holds. 1,000 civilians on board. Think about what would have happened if even one torpedo had reached its target. American intelligence was working well. Very well. Intercepting radio messages from the Japanese command, the Allies learned of the planned passage and immediately deployed over a dozen submarines for the intercept. The net was cast. But here, the Japanese got lucky. There was too little time to prepare the operation. Most American submarines were far from the required area and simply didn't have time to reach their positions. Those that did try to attack failed to achieve results. Several times, sonar operators on the Japanese ships reported submarines nearby. Several times, the escort dropped depth charges. Several times, the tension on the bridges reached its limit and then let go. The Japanese squadron sailed on. December 1944. The Ise and Hyuga enter the Kure naval base, intact, with fuel in their holds, with 1,000 living workers on board, with 12 main battery guns that hadn't fired a single shot during the entire passage. With that, the active service of both ships ended. They were placed in reserve, moored at the pier. They stood in the Kure harbor, massive, somber, with empty hangars and bare decks where the catapults used to be. Two ships without a role, without a mission, without planes, without a future. Kure seemed like a safe place, a closed harbor, shore batteries, anti-aircraft artillery. The Japanese command considered the base sufficiently protected. The American command thought otherwise. And in March 1945, they sent their answer. March 1945. Kure. Early in the morning, dots appeared over the horizon. There were more of them. Then, many more. Carrier-based planes of the U.S. Navy's 58th Task Force were heading for Kure in tight formations. Shore-based anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. The ships in the harbor opened fire. The sky over the base turned black with bursts. It didn't help. Bombs fell on docks, warehouses, and piers. The Ise stood by the shore, massive, motionless, unable to go anywhere. 2 direct hits. Explosions. Smoke. Damage. Serious, but not fatal. The crew managed the consequences. The ship held. 4 months passed. July 1945. The American command returned to Kure, this time with a different mood and a different number of planes. By the summer of 1945, Japanese anti-aircraft defense was so exhausted that American pilots worked almost without opposition. They made their runs methodically, calmly, like an exercise. The Ise stood in the same place. The first bombs destroyed the hangar, that same hangar that took over a year to build, that was supposed to hold 12 dive bombers, and that throughout its entire existence never received a single plane. The metal structures were twisted by explosions and folded inward like crumpled paper. The next hits landed on the superstructures, then on a main battery turret. That very turret, whose guns could send shells weighing 670 kilograms, a distance of 35.5 kilometers, fell silent forever. Deformations spread across the hull. Where the armor held the blow, the hull bent and cracked from the inside. But that wasn't the end, because the planes came again. During the second strike, the Ise received more than 10 direct hits from half-ton bombs. Not shrapnel, not near misses, direct hits. Each such bomb released energy upon explosion comparable to a small earthquake at the point of contact. More than 10 such blows in a row. The ship began taking on water. Slowly, but unstoppably. The pumps couldn't cope. The list grew. 5 degrees, 10, 15. The Ise was rolling over onto its side right at the pier, just a few kilometers from the shipyard where 30 years ago its construction had only just begun. Salvage operations yielded no results. On July 28, 1945, the Ise settled on the bottom of Kure harbor in shallow water. The water covered the gun turrets, covered the flight deck, covered the hangar without planes and the deck without catapults. It never left its home waters. In 30 years of service, the Ise never went far from the place where it was born. A few days earlier, the Hyuga had sunk in the same harbor, the sister ship. The ship built together, served together, converted together, and now lying on the bottom together. They came into this world together, and they left together. And then came silence. On September 2, 1945, the Japanese Empire signed the Act of Surrender. The war in the Pacific ended. On November 20th, 1945, the Ise and Hyuga were officially struck from the lists of the Imperial Japanese Navy. In the following years, diving teams inspected the sunken hulls. Part of the superstructures poked above the water, a silent monument to what had happened here. Gradually, most of the metal was raised and sent for smelting. The steel from which the gun turrets and armor plates were made turned into something else. What exactly? No one tracked anymore. Almost nothing remained of the two largest hybrid battleships in the world. Only photographs, only archival documents, only entries in ship logs now stored in archives. And the question that these ships ask us to this day: what was it all for? Let's go back to July 1945. An American pilot looks down through his cockpit glass. Below him is Kure Harbor, and a ship he cannot identify. Main battery turrets in front, a flight deck in the back. Something halfway between a battleship and an aircraft carrier. He doesn't know the story of this ship. He doesn't know about the 8-8 program that cost more than the entire Japanese state budget. He doesn't know about Midway and the 4 sunken carriers after which someone in the Tokyo headquarters decided to convert the battleships. He doesn't know about the one-way air group that never returned to the deck, about the hangar in which not a single plane ever stood, about the Battle of Cape Engano, where the ship was used as a live decoy without a single plane on board. He just sees a target and enters his attack run. That is the tragedy of the Ise and Hyuga. Not that they perished. Ships in war perish. It is part of their nature. The tragedy is something else. Throughout their entire existence, these two ships never fully managed to become what they were intended to be. Not once. As battleships, they were too late for the First World War, and were already outdated by the start of the Second. As aircraft carriers, they carried an air group that physically could not return to the deck. As aviation-carrying battleships, they went into their main battle with empty hangars. As supply ships, they carried someone else's cargo and someone else's people, because there was no one else left to carry them. Every time, almost, what was needed. But not quite. This was not the fault of the engineers. Japanese shipbuilders did something truly remarkable. To take a battleship that was already written off and turn it into something fundamentally new, in a few months, under wartime conditions, with constant shortages of resources. Technically, it was brilliant. And it was not the fault of the commanders. Admiral Ozawa, who led the Ise and Hyuga into battle at Cape Engano, knew exactly what he was doing. He went to his death consciously, and he fulfilled the task. His people fought to the end on ships that no longer had any chance of changing the outcome of the war. It was the fault of the system. A system that in 1907 conceived a fleet costing the entire state budget, which for 30 years built ships, cut programs, built again, and each time got something slightly less than planned. Which after Midway decided to convert battleships into carriers, because carriers were needed here and now, and thinking about where to get planes and pilots would come later. Which converted the ships, spent a year of work by thousands of people, and discovered that there were no pilots. Then, no planes. Then, no fuel. Then, nothing at all. The Ise and Hyuga were a mirror of the Japanese war machine of 1943 to 1945. On the outside, power, scale, engineering perfection. A grandiose form. On the inside, emptiness. A hangar without planes, catapults without pilots, ships without a future. But here is what is important to understand. The people who served on these ships were not part of an abstract war machine. They were living human beings. Sailors who cleaned the guns and scrubbed the decks. Officers who looked through binoculars at the horizon. Engineers who maintained the boilers in the sweltering holds. They didn't choose which ship to serve on. They didn't make the decisions to leave the air group on shore. They simply did their job on the ships they were given. And they deserve to be remembered. Today, almost nothing remains of the Ise and Hyuga. No museum, no monument. The metal was melted down long ago. At the bottom of Kure harbor, there are only fragments that divers occasionally find among the silt and seaweed. But in naval history, these two ships occupy a place that no one else will ever take. The Ise and Hyuga are the only full-scale hybrid battleships in world history to carry a combat-capable air group. There were never any other ships like them. Not before, not after. They were the first, they were the last, and they were the only ones. In this, if one is to look for the meaning of their existence, is where it lies. Not in victories that didn't happen, not in planes that never took off from their decks, but in the fact that at a moment when the system had backed itself into a corner, there were people who tried to find a way out. Unprecedented, impossible, almost insane. They built a ship that shouldn't have existed. And it existed. Thanks for watching, friends. See you in the next video.